So good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today at this parallel session on unleashing European AI leadership in the financial sector as part of the Center for Data Innovation's European AI Policy Conference. My name is Linda Strasdinja. I'm the head of technology practice and senior consultant at A4 Consulting, and it's my pleasure to be here today and moderate this session. Before introducing our guests and diving straight into the conversation, let me just say a few words as to the topic of the panel. And as we have already heard and seen this morning, AI is a very powerful tool that has the power to really transform the way services are delivered to customers, and not least in financial services, of course. However, of course, it does not alter the regulatory framework of the duty of care. So to properly understand the impact of AI, whether it will live up to the hype, it is necessary to consider what AI really is, what is it capable of, and at the same time, of course, also how do we address the regulatory and the ethical challenges associated with its use. And it is especially important in financial services, which historically has been a very highly regulated area. So in this session, we would like to explore how the financial services industry is implementing AI, how it is ensuring the responsible use of AI, what are the current industry practices, and then, of course, on the at the same side, also how is the public sector reacting, what steps can policymakers take, make the EU a leader in adopting digital technologies in the financial services sector. So I'm very glad to have an excellent panel here with me today to discuss these questions. And I would like to welcome Andrej Kovarik, who is a member of the European Parliament from the Renew Europe group, Roland van der Steppen, who's the head of regulatory affairs for Europe for Visa, and hopefully very soon also Jan Seysens, who is the head of the digital finance unit at DG FISMA at the European Commission. So thank you for being here today. And just for the audience, of course, we want this to be an engaging panel. So please do use the chat function to ask questions to the panelists, and I will go through them during the panel discussion. To begin the panel, I would first like to turn to you, Roland, and maybe to set the scene a bit, maybe you could give us an overview as to what are the current AI applications in the financial industry, and of course, what kind of AI applications is Visa using? Are the current cases more customer-facing, or are there also important back-office opportunities? So over to you, Roland.
Well, thank you, Linda. And obviously, conscious I'm the only industry representative of this panel, so we have a particular angle to this, but I'll do my best for the introduction. So I think everyone knows Visa, but it's always helpful, I guess, to always explain a bit what we do. We are essentially a payments network, but also a payments technology service provider when it's not about card-based payments. And as Visa, we've been early adopters of AI already since the beginning of the 90s, and that's quite some time ago. And for us, AI has really allowed us to do real-time risk-based fraud analytics and also improve the operational resilience of our network. So in many ways, you could say that AI has been instrumental to kind of help build the consumer trust in the Visa brand as it stands high today. And thanks to AI, for example, we've been getting better and quicker at problem solving for the clients which operate on a network. So that can be banks or fintech players, but also helps to build the security and trust by consumers that transact over network. So essentially, Visa, even though everyone knows it and is one of the biggest or most valued consumer brands, we are essentially a business company. So when we talk about and also AI applications or AI usage is very much from then you could say almost back office or perspective of towards our clients. So it's not directly consumer facing. However, and just looking around in the financial services sector, we do see there are applications of AI that are consumer facing. There's also a lot of opportunities. And having worked at a bank before, obviously there are issues like robo-advice or automated credit scoring, all that can benefit from AI issues with a particular set of obviously policy questions and challenges. But maybe I'll pause here.
Okay, thank you, Roland. Maybe a question to Andre for a bit of setting the scene from your side. You've been very active on digital finance topics in the European Parliament, and you were the rapporteur for an own initiative report on digital finance. So maybe how do you see these developments, and you can give us a bit of the European Parliament's view.
Thank you, Linda. Again, good morning, and thank you for the invitation. And I'm really happy to be with you today on this panel. I think we are discussing actually very important issue on basically one of the, I think at this point, one of the most advanced and developed way an application of AI technology in the business sector. And as I think it has been well demonstrated by Roland on the example of Visa payment, I think there has been actually quite a vivid environment for financial services providers in actually uptaking AI technologies and developing both the usage that would enhance their business operations, let's say in words, but also to enhance the customer experience and maybe offer new types of products to their customers, be it the final user, be it a business customer. I think it works both ways. You mentioned let's say the European institutions take on these issues. I actually had also opportunity to work on a couple of files that were dealt with by other committees, basically dealing with the horizontal applications of AI technology throughout various types of businesses. And I think it works very well, and it applies very well also to financial services. We obviously are in the Parliament very much concerned about first of all, the guarantees that are linked to the use of AI, that it will not compromise, let's say, the basic principles and the rights the customers are benefiting from based on the existing EU legislation and the regulatory framework that we have, be it customer protection or consumer protection, be it investors protection, be it a non-discrimination principle, be it an accountability of decisions that actually are taken through the AI technology applications. So I think those are, let's say, the key principles that we in the European Parliament especially are very attached to. But at the same time, and I think this was also one of the messages of the report that the Parliament adopted last 2 months ago, that we are aware of the fact that AI technology benefits is a potential for European companies by enhancing the uptake and use of the technology to actually become global leaders in some of their business sectors. So we should actually set the framework so that the innovation is actually not blocked, so that we are able to use the technology. We are able to remain an open in business environment, and we are actually able to provide and as I said, enhanced services that would actually provide benefits for the final users. So I think that could be like the most, let's say, the general lines that we were discussing when dealing with those issues in the European Parliament.
Thank you, Andre. And I think a lot of the topics that you've raised also go through and try to cover in this panel. Welcome, Jan. I hope you can hear us and everything is fine from a technical point of view.
Yes, hello. Apologies, I had some issues. Sorry for that.
No problem. I'm sorry to kind of jump right at you, but maybe, so we just started a panel. We're talking, so to set the scene, maybe you could tell us from the Commission's point of view about a bit of the Commission's digital finance package that, of course, you adopted in September this year. How do you want to support the digital finance in terms of competition and innovation, and in particular, of course, when it comes to data-driven finance, and maybe what is like your approach to the use of AI in financial services?
Yeah, thanks very much indeed. And I'm sure Andre already gave a very good introduction to the topic. I think we are actually quite close, I would say, in terms of our positions from the European Parliament and the and objectives and the European Commission. So indeed, we had actually set out in September a digital finance strategy, which let's say would set out how, I mean, where we want to get in terms of let's say digital finance in Europe, where we indeed actually think this is something which we need to support and develop. And we also think this is something where Europe can provide added value, because many solutions will be deployed at European scale, and actually also the European internal market is an opportunity actually for citizens and businesses to use even more digital access, even better digital means to manage their finances. So it's really a European topic, and we have set out indeed a couple of actions as well, indeed, how we from the European Commission would like actually to support this development and the deployment of indeed new technologies in the financial sector, and artificial intelligence is one of them. So I think from our side, how do we go about this? Indeed, I think we have actually a number of areas, a number of measures, and I think they all in a way belong together. Of course, AI requires access to data, so I think we have set out for different types of data, indeed, also as part of the broader data strategy of the Commission, how we want to improve access actually to maybe machine readable access to public data, access to non-public data, then also, for example, the kind of data sharing we have in the Payment Services Directive. So I think that's really the first element which is very important for the development of AI. Of course, the second element is that you need also indeed access to, let's say, important processing capacity. So we want to facilitate actually also the use of cloud services by financial institutions, which are useful in this context, by providing also a kind of a clear regulatory framework for that. And the third element is, of course, that we look also at artificial intelligence more particularly, and its use in the financial sector. Now, I think from our perspective, our impression is also the feedback we got from the market is that we're probably still at a relatively more of an early stage of this, even though the financial sector may be more developed than some other sectors, but still it is a relatively early stage. And one of the points which basically where we can also contribute is indeed to provide legal clarity and legal certainty. There's a lot of uncertainty actually about how artificial intelligence would be actually considered, for example, by financial supervisors. And what the broader regulatory framework would be. And as you know, I think the Commission is preparing actually a broader initiative on the legislative framework for artificial intelligence. And we would complement that indeed also with particular guidelines in the financial sector to understand and to clarify how supervisors basically would look at those technologies. Because it is also clear, and I think you can read this now over the past actually days. I saw it almost every day in the press, some specific cases, for example, on creditworthiness assessments being made based on data and that being criticized, or other uses, insurance or others. If basically people don't have the confidence that all of this is done with due regard to indeed their data, due protection of their data, then I think it will be facing a lot of criticism, and we may not very soon talk about the deployment of AI, but we may more talk about how to limit it actually. And that's, I think, not the kind of approach we would like to take. We do think it has a lot of opportunities, but to actually also then harness them, it is indispensable that there is a clear regulatory framework and also clear kind of rules in terms of the protection of data, of fundamental rights, and other matters.
Thank you very much. So this kind of brings us perfectly into the next topic. So we started touching upon the regulatory aspects of AI. So I would like to dig deeper a bit into this topic. And you mentioned of course, a common concern among both the supervisors and the industry is how do we interpret, how do we adapt the pre-existing regulation to new technologies such as AI? So maybe first I turn to you, Roland. Do you see, from a visa's point of view, are there any barriers to adoption that stem from regulation? Would you like to have like more guidance, more clarity as to, you know, when developing new AI-powered applications?
I think like both Jan and Andre already mentioned, like I think financial services is among the most heavily regulated sectors already there, also strict supervision. I think if you develop or deploy AI, you are subject to a lot of regulation with respect to fundamental rights, competition rules, consumer protection, and fair commercial practices, and so forth. So from our perspective, it's probably more a matter of interpretation with respect to the application of AI in that context rather than the creation of new rules. And we would also benefit from consistent and supervisory interpretation in that context, and very much geared towards the use cases. And I understand we will touch on that later.
Do you see that the EU is leading in the terms of uptake and implementation of AI in the financial services sector?
So I think if you just look across different regions, we would think like China is ahead on AI. Obviously, they have a centralized data pool, and they have like a big market. And compared to that, Europe still has a fragmented data market. But very much, you know, appreciate what the Commission is trying to achieve with the data spaces in different sectors. I think that's a good way to go. Then the US has another comparative advantage to the EU in terms of access to funding and funding, but Europe is ahead on what else is very important. That's skills and basic research, and that's actually a theme that you see across different sectors. We often have the talent, but lack the opportunity for commercial application, because often someone starts with a good idea in a given market, but it's easier maybe to go to the US also, maybe to be rewarded for it. I think we really need to overcome the obstacle from basic research towards commercial application in Europe across different sectors, not only in AI, to make this a success.
Yeah. And Andre, do you have maybe some comments on this as to what do you think how is the EU doing in terms of uptake of innovative technologies in the financial services sector?
I have to agree. I think with what has just been said. I really see that there is a lot of potential. There's a lot of actually good ideas circling around around businesses in Europe. I truly believe that at some point we hit the problem with the access to finance, which I think is one of the issues. If there is an uptake and actually scale up of a particular use of a technology, there's a lot of actually actors in the EU who would rather go somewhere else because of the availability of funding, obviously. But I think we also be one of the issues to address, but that's, I think, more in more general terms. But I think what is also crucial for us, and I believe that this is also sort of in the interest of the businesses in Europe, and also sort of a core idea of the Commission proposal of the Digital Financial Services Package. It's actually to tackle the fragmentation of the EU market. I mean, we're 27. The strength of it. It's actually, especially in digital services, the strength of it is actually that you can provide your services or offer your products all over the entire EU, and very often when you speak to the representative of industry, there's a lot of actually issues that are just linked to how difficult it's to tackle different barriers and obstacles existing in cross-border when they actually trying to develop their cross-border activities. And I think it has a lot of to do with also what has been maybe not properly harmonized approach by supervisors. So I think those are the issues that sort of maybe prevent us to benefit from the full potential in this area, and I think would be good to address, because at the same time, it seems that if we are able to agree on a set of standards that applies properly around the EU single market, then it allows businesses to grow, and it can actually be also an important asset globally. Like you mentioned, for example, the data protection rules are already existing. So I think the fragmentation is we definitely have some shortcomings also in the access to data. I think very important thing, and that's from the public sector point of view, it's actually the possibility to have an access to public sector data, which I think if you look on one of the takeaways from the pandemic, actually the public institutions are gathering incredible amount of data, but they are not always easily accessible or accessible at all for businesses to develop their application out of it. So I think these are also the sort of alleys that we should take look into and see what we can do all over the EU in order to enhance and sort of boost also the potential of the financial services sector.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned several topics that, of course, access to data that I would also like to touch upon a bit later. But maybe, do you think, I mean, besides you mentioned fragmentation, the issues of supervision, do you think there's the existing regulation needs to be, like more concretely, any existing regulations need to be adapted to reflect these changing interactions between financial institutions on the one hand and the customers and the emergence of new players that are using AI or the incumbent players using AI in these interactions?
Yeah, I think that is actually a good question from let's say the legislators or regulators' point of view. This is where to see whether we are actually sort of up to date with our regulatory framework. But at the same time, I believe that we already have in place number of regulatory or number of rules actually applied that can already be fit for digital applications, and this includes the financial sector. And I also believe that we also have to see whether the uptake of new technologies such as AI is actually profoundly changing the way the financial services or the market is organized and the financial services are offered or structured, or if it's actually providing and supplying new types of products or new types of services that were not existing before, and that those can be actually falling outside of the scope of the existing regulation. These are, I think, the questions we should have, and I think to a certain extent, as it also applies for some parts of financial services, we already have in place regulatory framework that can actually sort of adapt to the newer challenges. But I think it's also for us the key, and it's usually the hardest part. Jan can definitely confirm that the hardest part is actually to come up with a framework which is actually not too much attached to the current state of play, but it's actually forward-looking. It's open, and it's actually something that gives us opportunity to be used and applied for years to come, not to have a requirement to update it every single year or every other year, because I mean, we are not the fastest legislators in the world. It takes some time before a particular legislation is drafted, negotiated, is adopted, and is applied. So I think, and this pace is maybe not exactly the same pace as the technology develops. But I think for us the key would be really look into issues that should be covered, and then to see how can we sort of address that, but not to get stuck with what we have currently, but to have an open sort of minded and future facing approach. And I think, for example, if we discuss, it was mentioned by Roland, operational resilience issues, where we have currently I think a very good proposal from the Commission on our table. I think this is exactly the type of legislation where we think that there is a point in upgrading the rules regarding cybersecurity, but also we are aware of the fact that, I mean, we are setting sort of a standard for a decade or so right now. So this is something that we should be always bearing in mind when trying to set and balance properly the regulatory framework that we want to have in the EU.
Yeah. I think, Andre, you put it very well, that of course the challenge of regulation is you want to provide a legal framework that would encourage innovation and investments into innovation, enable growth, but at the same time, of course, you need to protect the consumers, address the different legal, social, economical issues associated with technologies, and not least with artificial intelligence. So maybe I turn to you, Jan. From the Commission's point of view, I mean, do you see any need you addressed it already a little bit, but do you see any need to propose any adaptations to the current EU regulatory framework? And are there any concerns or questions that you as policymakers see that the current legislation does not fully capture when it comes to AI, adopting AI in financial services?
Yeah, thanks. Before reacting to this, I also want to again, I think, underline and support the various factors actually, which also Roland and Andre mentioned in terms of kind of how we can also further improve Europe's position in this area. I mean, the data, access to data, access to skills, access to money in the end. I mean, I think they're all things where we have to do further work in Europe. That's very clear, and I think, as the colleagues mentioned, we are on the journey there on the data strategy. We recently, as the Commission, set up a digital education action plan. I think the main tool we have there is indeed funding and networking across borders, actually. And that's very strongly happening. And on investment, I want to, let's say, maybe be a bit more positive. Actually, interestingly, fintech is among all the sectors, all the innovative sectors in Europe, is the sector where you have the highest investment, the highest venture capital investment, actually. And you see indeed actually also more and more international investors coming to Europe and providing funding, which I think is good news for us. And it's also partly, in a way, what we want to achieve with the Capital Markets Union project, which we are still further developing. It's a bit of a separate track, but I mean, the idea is exactly this: that we really need venture capital funding for these kind of areas to actually succeed, and we need this funding to be available in Europe. So I just wanted to kind of stress and highlight that I think we are working on all of those areas, and I share actually the consideration that those are key ones. Now, of course, in finance, indeed, regulation is probably the fourth factor, which can basically can either help or it can hinder. And on our side, I think there's probably, as so often, there is not one size fits all. I think in the financial sector, what you have to take into account is indeed that we have an existing regulatory framework, that we also have supervisors who actually supervise many financial firms in terms of their risk governance, for example. And in that sense, some AI applications actually are very relevant to that. Of course, if you use AI to do anti-money laundering due diligence, or to improve your internal risk models for capital purposes, that's very relevant indeed to the existing legislation. Then there are other kind of use cases where in that sense, sorry, just to maybe conclude on that, also respond to your question. In that sense, basically, the way forward is simply that supervisors need to kind of properly understand, and there's a lot of work ongoing there, whether it's from the European authorities, from for example, ACPR in France or others. Supervisors need to understand how is AI changing, and how do they need to respond in terms of their supervisory, let's say, activities, and what kind of new guidance they need to give basically in the market. There are other applications which are more directly relevant indeed for fundamental rights, for example, where indeed the discussion is whether maybe some supplementary elements are necessary. Yeah? For example, also to give a concrete example, let's say data exchange under the Payment Service Directive 2 was probably one of the ways achieving data to input this AI. And there, indeed, the data protection authorities and the financial supervisors are working jointly on guidelines, actually, how this could work. But I mean, there are, of course, AI poses additional, let's say, issues, additional points in terms of explainability, in terms of possible bias, inherent bias, which maybe merit some further and additional considerations. And that's, I think, where we need further work and reflection on how this actually can be addressed. So I think the short answer is it really depends, and AI is, even in the financial sector, AI is not just AI. One needs to look at the specific use cases and how they and what's the best way of indeed creating legal certainty and clarity in this area and protecting the rights.
Yeah, and you meant, of course, we all know that the Commission is going to come out with an AI legislation next year. So maybe you could also tell us a bit more how does the broader Commission's ongoing work is going to fit into the digital finance work stream and relate to the existing legislation in financial services?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So indeed, I think you know that this cross-sectoral work, and I think it's been discussed in your conference also in many other contexts, that it indeed will set up a general framework with some basic principles, and they will of course also be, let's say, relevant to the financial sector, again depending on the specific use cases, and I think it is then important, and that's what we're working on right now, to make sure that this interacts properly indeed with the existing legislative framework of the financial sector, which I mentioned, and indeed also the existing authorities, the supervisors in the financial sector. So that's indeed something which we are working on right now, and there is not, I mean, there's not an easy answer to those matters. I mean, people have been, and I mentioned data protection before, because I think it's in maybe a similar area where there's a cross-sectoral regulatory framework and the need for kind of interaction. I think there we've seen a very strong role indeed also for cross-sectoral data protection authorities. Whether AI is exactly in the same league, I would probably think that in many aspects it is a bit more kind of, let's say, sector specific, also in terms of the users and the applications. But that's exactly something which is being now considered within the Commission indeed.
Okay, thank you. I would just like to remind the participants, please do feel free to use the chat function to ask any questions to the panelists. And Roland, I would like to turn to you. Maybe now you've heard from Andre, you've heard from Jan about the various ongoing work that is in the Commission and the Parliament, and how do you look at the measures of this digital finance work stream? Are there any competing or conflicting objectives or measures from your point of view?
So obviously we looked at the digital finance action plan and also the retail payments strategy. Obviously that's of key importance to us. I think in general, like we look at PSD2 having been a catalyst for open banking in Europe and also driving towards an open payment ecosystem. We would kind of argue that within an open payment ecosystem, that also means that more parties have access to data. So it's really important to make sure that you raise the bar in terms of security and resilience across different ecosystem participants. So from that perspective, very much welcome DORA, which is also part of this package, because it does do that, raise the cyber hygiene bar for all. We do think that more can be done in terms of making sure that PSD2 reaches its full potential. And even though a lot of people think of Visa as a card network only, we're also essentially a payments technology service provider in an open banking or instant payments context. And if you compare the relative success of open banking in Europe with that of other regions, we think there are some lessons learned, especially if you want to move towards an open finance context. And we would kind of would like to see a more principle-based and also market-driven approach towards open banking in Europe. And I think what is really a differentiator between Europe and other regions is the fact that in Europe we had the requirement for banks to provide APIs free of charge, whereas in other regions there was more a commercial model at the very beginning underpinning the whole data sharing, and this has allowed, I think, some of the marketplace there to have their incentives to continue to invest and develop clear consumer use cases. And I think that's something we really need to have in mind when we talk about moving from open banking to open finance. Obviously, not everything is bad. I think the Commission has, I think it's also thanks to PC2 that we have seen the emergence of many of those fintech players that Jan already talked about before. And then maybe one last point, I think that principle and or outcome-based approach would not only be helpful within the context of open banking, but more generally, as we see, the retail payment strategy is there to allow for the building blocks for pan-European instant payment solutions, which essentially you could argue are those payment providers from the open banking context to bring them to the point of sale so that you could pay with them also in the shops. But obviously there are also other payment instruments like cards or in the future even cryptocurrencies that we think it would be helpful to set certain objective measures like fraud targets, service delivery, and let the market innovate against this objective set of criteria, so that you, as a policymaker, you avoid maybe nudging into a certain direction or preferring a certain technology. And I think that would be something that we would support, but a lot what's in the package already, in the digital finance package, we can support as Visa.
Thank you, Roland. And of course, we've been talking already about access to data a lot, and the access to data, and of course, access to good quality data for financial services is key to really unleash the potential of AI technologies and financial services. And some have stated even that the winners or losers in this new digital financial services landscape will be defined by who can best access, utilize, process, and analyze data. So maybe, Andre, turning to you, like, how do you see the role of the EU in this, in providing more access to data? And I see also a question, should big tech companies be obliged to open up their data? So maybe you can combine those two questions.
Yes, thank you. Well, the big tech question, I think it's a very valid one, and it's usually, well, sometimes it's the elephant in the room when we have discussions about the access to data. But maybe in general terms, I think that's the I think one of the key, let's say, policy lines that the current Commission and I believe also the current European Parliament are actually taking forward. And we saw a European data strategy published earlier this year, which I think sort of sets the scene for the way that we want to handle data, and especially the access to data in the European Union. I think, as it has been said, I mean, we have a number of safeguards and principles that we sort of cherish in the European Union. I think data protection, data privacy is one thing that's what regards the data, and that's clear. But I think we have sort of a unused potential regarding the use of so-called industrial data, but let's say the business data in general. I was mentioning the public data. I really think this is an important part where because we can do much from let's say the public sector side in providing standardized format, in actually providing access to those data. But at the same time, in general, when it comes to, let's say, setting a framework for the EU businesses to have access to data, and especially with regards to financial services, I think it's inevitably the future that we have to sort of look into, and that's the open banking and the open finance. I mean, as it has been already said quite rightly, and I think the PSD too, especially here, was an important element in setting the directions that we want to take. But I think we should go further in this regard. But the thing is, and I think this is something important to say, it's actually especially when we talk about access to data and data analysis and big data in general, it seems more and more important that we look over the sectors or cross sectors. because I mean, strictly financial data, or let's say financial services data, can definitely provide a an important input for companies, but it seems that it's actually the cross sector data sharing that would benefit even more. And I think this is an avenue which we should also explore in the EU. And this brings me sort of big techs, because obviously, especially the huge technology companies which are developing their business activities across the sectors, they have the cross-sectoral data, and they are able actually to evaluate them and use them in order to then make sure that they are, for example, for providing products that are sort of focusing the customer's needs in this regard. And they are able to enhance them and actually improve them by providing enormous amounts of data. I'm not sure that if we are able actually to oblige all the big techs to open the data they have. I think this may be a too difficult goal to set. But for example, if we talk specifically about the financial services, and we have a big tech acting as a financial institution because they are entering the financial services area, then they should comply with the existing regulation, and they have to be able to provide the access to data in this regard as well. So I think maybe this is sort of an opening door for us to see how we can cooperate with especially with big techs. But I think that would be sort of an approach how to go forward, and maybe have some tangible results in a short amount of time. And so instead of having legal rules that would sort of oblige entities, then maybe to start basically discussing with the big techs on those issues, and see where the existing framework is actually already applicable to the big techs. And I think we will see a number of horizontal cross-sectoral legislation coming basically this month on digital services from. And I think this can be also sort of a source of considerations or reflections how we can actually better approach this specific problem. But I think it is an important question to raise and bear in mind when we are actually trying to set regulatory framework within the EU.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Andre. And maybe Jan, I turn to you. Do you have any reactions to what Andre has said? Do you agree, or?
I have very little reaction in the sense that I agree with almost everything he said. I mean, on the specific, as was mentioned, on the specific question, of course, of big tech and opening of data. Indeed, as Andre mentioned, that is one of the questions which are under consideration now in the preparations of the Digital Markets Act. I would be a bit hesitant to make too close and exact links to the Payment Service Directive, because it's not the same situation. I mean, if you dig deeper, probably if you did the same than you did for PSD, it would probably fail, because it would not help anybody, because the situation is different. It's much more diverse, let's say, area of activities actually. So the solution necessarily needs to be a bit different, but indeed it's something which is being considered right now. I think I see also, if I look a bit at the chat as well, at the questions from participants, a lot of actually interesting let's say, indeed, questions about specific applications and the opportunities for intangible asset valuation, for example. Yes, where indeed, I mean, the question of information and prediction, actually, the lack of capacity to predict is one of the key problems. Why intangible assets are difficult to evaluate, are being often valued very conservatively, and in that sense, that hinders very often access to credit for SMEs. So that is something where potentially, indeed, AI, which is precisely aimed at predictions, could help. But of course, we have to see how this develops, to what extent this is really reliable, and that's again also, I think, where a proper process where indeed, I mean, there's also a certain let's say reflection on well, how reliable are these AI applications? Is the outcome actually, does it actually serve their purpose? Is it worth, or is it just in the end random? And also then indeed what kind of safeguards do you also need to make sure that this does not then turn against certain parts of people? Of course, if you only make this available for certain de facto for certain parts of the population or for certain types of assets, then it's more complicated. So, but in principle, that's the kind of areas where indeed there could be potential. There are a couple of other ones. I think there was also the question, what do we consider the strategic areas for AI in Europe to develop? I mean, it's a very interesting question. It's not necessarily for us in the first instance to answer. Also, the market and industry players need to see what that is the case. But if I can mention a couple of them, I mean, I think certainly given that the heart of the financial sector is in the end risk assessment, if certainly that is kind of a must. If you are kind of, I mean, if you as a company whose core business is risk assessment, you don't take the opportunities of AI in this area, then at some point you may have problems. And I would also maybe mention the areas where Europe has a general lead, whether it is the interaction between finance and industry, or right now indeed sustainable finance, where there's also a huge kind of actually need to predict risks, also to analyze data. I think those should also be, in my view, priority areas where European actors are particularly well placed, actually based on the basis we have, the policy making basis, the industrial basis we have, actually then to combine that also with financial applications and develop let's say further priorities here.
Okay. Thank you, Jan. Finally, as I see we're nearing a bit towards the end of our panel, but I would still like to tackle one more broader issue, because of course we cannot talk about AI if we do not talk about such topics as trust, accountability, and ethics. We've already touched upon it a little bit, but just I would like to still touch upon this a little bit more and deep dive into this. So Roland, maybe there has been, of course, a growing momentum around the world, not least in the EU, around the topic of responsible use of AI, about encouraging corporate social responsibility, development of different guidances, principles around transparency, ethics, and fairness. So maybe you could tell us a bit like what are the best practices that Visa is implementing? How is Visa looking at this guidances? How is it integrating it, these considerations in their AI deployment?
So for us, like if the way we approach it, like to use data and AI responsibly, for us means to have the right governance structures in place, and also the right accountability structures in place, which notably respect to data privacy and risk management. So what we have done as Visa is we established something we called the Visa Data Usage Council, and also obviously have a model risk management committee. And these kind of bring together subject matter experts, but also senior executives. And they, for example, have deliberated and developed our own internal guidelines on how those responsible data uses look like. And they've been informed by, I would say, the multitude of different frameworks that we have seen popping up across the world. I think the latest we count, we've seen 86. We try to engage with many of them, and really see this continual dialogue between regulators and industry as a way, the way forward. We try to always integrate best practices when we move forward, and we think more broadly that in a way, kind of support the approach by the Commission, which is to promote innovation in AI, but then it should go hand in hand with developing an AI ethics framework.
Yeah, and looking at the global context, also, what would the EU AI framework mean for a global financial services player such as Visa?
So obviously, as a truly global company, we would definitely benefit and support as much global consistency as possible, because it also gives us legal certainty. And I think most importantly, given that we mainly use AI from a fraud prevention perspective. Having a global consistent framework would also hopefully limit limitations to cross-border data flows, which we think is important from a data quality perspective, because cross-border data flows are for us an important input to have the best fraud prevention possible, because you cannot do that only at the regional level.
Yeah. Andre, you already also talked about the issue of trust, which of course is very important in the financial services sector. How do you see this basically in the financial services sector when applying AI solutions? And do you think should automated financial services fall into this Commission's scope of high risk AI applications?
Well, I was mentioning that I think at the beginning of our panel when we discussed, like, let's say the general view that let's say the European Parliament, but I think in general the take when it comes to more advanced use of AI technologies. I think and we have recently adopted in the European Parliament a number of reports regarding the use of AI, especially regarding the ethical aspects and et cetera, et cetera. And I think these are quite important and fundamental principles for us, so that exactly as it has been said, the trust is there, but also that we are actually not, and I think Jan put it exactly, that we are not in the situation when we, instead of enhancing the use of AI application, we have debates about how to limit it, because it's just it doesn't really meet our expectation, but it doesn't really respect the fundamental principles. And I think in this regard, it's clear for me also from what Roland said, that the companies are very much aware of it, because if the use and proper use of AI technologies will become a competitive edge for a company, it has to have its trust from the customers that it's reliable, it's secure, it's not discriminating, it's clear the way it's actually functioning. So I think these are also the key concerns. What we say in the European Parliament regarding the AI technology, we talk about accountability, we talk about human-centric technology. We obviously talk about technology that is not, as I mentioned, discriminating, that is not actually introducing even involuntarily some sort of a bias into the way it operates, that it actually fully respects issues of transparency, issue of data privacy, and as I mentioned at the beginning, respects fully consumer protection, etc., etc. The question whether include the automated financial services into the high risk application, I think this is very much about proportionality and also the way those types of financial services can actually influence the way the market is organized and functions. And this is, I think, something very important. From the country I know best, in the Czech Republic, we had companies that were providing trading schemes based on very advanced AI applications, which in the end became a fraudulent and eventually criminal cases. So yes, those were very high risk applications of AI technologies, but obviously there was also an intention of the misuse of those types of technologies. So I think it's again more about transparency, the information that the end users actually get about the uses of such technology. So I think in this regard, I would be a little bit cautious. I think indeed there may be some applications that may need some considerations in this regard, but I think it's really about proportionality.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Andre. And then maybe quickly to you, Jan. So which policies do you think could support consumer trust? And maybe I'll also ask you this, whether high-risk AI applications should be applied to financial services?
No, I think on consumer trust, indeed, I think I agree with much what Andre said. I think people need to have, well, I mean, it's the fundamental principles which have been developed for AI, but they're still relevant. I mean, transparency, explainability are just two of the examples. That is very, I mean, and it's obvious in theory, but to implement this actually in practice is very, very difficult. I mean, we have the example we have many pieces of legislation in finance where we provide all kinds of information to people, and the result is very often that people will just get 50 pages of document, they will just sign it at the end, and they will not read any of it. So I mean that's I think all the things to reflect on how these objectives of transparency and explainability, for example, can actually be actually achieved. But that is something we have to do, and I think indeed the data protection element is a third one. On the question of high risk or not, honestly, I mean I don't really want to put so much emphasis on this. It's not. I mean nobody I'm aware of in the Commission or in the Parliament is. I mean sounds sometimes like a bit. People would be dividing the world into good and bad and black and white. I mean, that's not what it's about. I think the question is, what is the right risk management tools you have for different kinds of applications? I think that's the real question to ask. And in that sense, I think in any event, any kind of supervised financial services are a bit different from other, I mean, definitely from products, but also from other services, because indeed we have an ongoing supervisory relationship with supervisors. So that's one aspect to be taken into account. And then one however have to look at what specifically does that mean for the specific applications. Of course, there can be some applications which can be particularly sensitive for fundamental rights, even though I would probably see other sectors maybe a bit more pertinent here. I mean, in the financial sector, yes, you have the access to bank accounts, for example. We have special rules on that. And then, of course, if you look at it from the perspective of systemic risk, that's again a quite different perspective. And there we have, again, specific rules on actually high-frequency trading, which is probably an area, automated trading, where you could see systemic risks coming. But that's, again, quite different. So unfortunately, I will not give you a clear answer to this black and white question. I hope I have provided you some elements for consideration.
Yeah, I didn't expect a black and white answer. So. But unfortunately, the time for our panel is over. But of course, I think we could discuss this much longer. I mean, I certainly had a lot more questions, but I would like to thank all of the panelists for a really interesting discussion. It was really my great pleasure to moderate. Of course, thank you to the audience and the organizers, the Center for Data Innovation, for gathering all of us here today, even if it's been in a virtual format as it is used to nowadays. So yeah, thank you to the panelists. Have a nice day, everyone. And of course, we very much look forward to the remainder of the day. And up next, I believe, is a panel discussion on what should be in Europe's AI legislation. So I think a good path from our panel to the next one then. So thank you very much.
Thank you.